In the last episode, tensions ran high as Bailey urged Carlisle to address the recent incident where his soldiers disrespected Ashia's troops. Carlisle was initially hesitant, unsure of how Ashia might react. But Bailey, ever the advisor, reminded him of a similar occurrence with the servants, where Ashia's anger had been swift and intense. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Carlisle finally decided to meet with Ashia before her fury could erupt once again. When Ashia stormed into Carlisle's office moments later, her fierce expression spoke volumes. Carlisle, feeling the weight of her gaze, remarked that her look alone told him she had already heard the news. Without further delay, he admitted that it was indeed his guards who had initiated the skirmish and sincerely offered his apologies on their behalf. Ashia, her face still stern, accepted his apology. Carlisle, sensing the tension, added another apology for the vulgar language used by his men. In response, Ashia offered a curt but genuine thanks. An awkward silence followed, thick with unspoken words, until Bailey, ever the mediator, chimed in with a suggestion: how about we train both forces together? That way, something like this won't happen again. Ashia's eyebrows raised as she questioned, do you really think they won't fight even more if we do that? Bailey explained that while there might be some initial friction, both sides could eventually benefit from each other's military strength. But before Bailey could finish, Carlisle cut him off, his pride clearly wounded. That idea bruises my pride, he declared. Ashia, ever composed but equally proud, agreed, adding, it bruises mine as well. Carlisle's eyes narrowed as he shot back, are you saying the Pervaz army is stronger than mine? With unwavering confidence, Ashia clarified, if it were army against army, we would definitely lose. But in a one-on-one, fair fight, I don't think we would. Carlisle, his pride stinging, asked with disbelief, are you serious? Ashia, standing her ground, replied with unwavering certainty, of course I am. Bailey, sensing the brewing storm, tried to defuse the situation, but it was too late. The Cold War between Carlisle and Ashia had already begun, and Bailey knew there was no stopping it now. 2 days later, all the soldiers from Ashia's and Carlisle's forces assembled on the same training ground, the atmosphere tense but charged with anticipation. As the leaders, Carlisle and Ashia, stepped forward, they shouted, attention, in unison. Instantly, their troops saluted, each in their own distinct style. Carlisle leaned toward Ashia and whispered with a smirk, your salute looks kind of cool, but don't you think it's a bit overdramatic? Ashia, unfazed, responded casually, they've always been like this. Taking the lead, Carlisle addressed the gathered soldiers. From now on, he announced, his voice firm and commanding, the Pervaz army and my own forces will begin joint training. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsettled by the sudden change, especially after their recent confrontation. Sensing their discomfort, Carlisle continued, I know many of you might feel embarrassed or annoyed, considering the argument that broke out between our two groups just a few days ago. But after careful thought, we've decided that joint training is necessary. He paused, letting his words sink in before driving the point home. When the Igrams raided Pervaz, its army was too small to stop them effectively. If Pervaz's army were to fall or disappear in the future, it would leave our own guards at a disadvantage too. We are stronger together, and that's why this training is essential, for the survival of both our forces. Ashia scanned the tense atmosphere and could already sense that the backlash from the soldiers would be intense. Carlisle, undeterred, pressed on, explaining that their joint training system would be based primarily on Pervaz's methods, but they would incorporate useful strategies from his army's ways as well. One soldier, unable to contain his frustration, blurted out, Pervaz's army isn't even a proper army to begin with. Isn't it obvious we should stick to our more advanced techniques? Carlisle's gaze hardened as he turned to his men. Do any of you know the savage tribes that dwell in the abandoned lands better than the Pervaz guards do? He challenged. One of the soldiers, clearly frustrated, shouted back, no war starts with knowing the enemy like the back of your hand. Carlisle's expression grew serious, his voice steady and authoritative. That may be true when your enemy fights with the same rules you do. But the barbarians don't play by common sense or strategy. They fight like individuals, wild and unpredictable. If we rely too much on our complex chain of command, we'll end up getting stabbed in the back. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. There are already soldiers here who know how to fight enemies we can't predict. If you cling to your pride and ignore that, you'll become nothing more than a laughing stock when we face them. His words struck a chord. As the training progressed, Ashia quietly admitted to Carlisle, if I had been the top commander, I doubt they would have agreed so easily. Carlisle, with a knowing smile, replied, I still believe that the one with more knowledge and information about the enemy should hold the authority. But it's fine, you weren't as stubborn as I expected. After a brief pause, Carlisle shifted his attention to Haven's guard commander, Isaac Solon. With a teasing glint in his eye, he called out, "Isaac, how about a spar? Let's see if you've gotten any better since you haven't won a single one against me yet." The challenge was light-hearted but competitive, and Isaac, ever ready to prove himself, accepted. The duel began, their swords clashing as the two commanders exchanged strikes. Isaac fought hard, giving Carlisle a tough match, but in the end, Carlisle's speed and sharp, swift movements secured his victory once again. Decker, observing from the sidelines, noticed something remarkable. Slowly but surely, the gap between the two armies was shrinking. Soldiers who had once been at odds were now learning from each other, working together, and sharing their knowledge, the tension of earlier days fading away. Later that night, after going through a mountain of pending work, Ashia and Decker decided to call it a night. As Ashia made her way to leave, Decker hesitated for a moment before stopping her. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. Ashia paused, her expression thoughtful. "The soldiers will get along better over time, as they continue to train together. Everything in Pervaz has been working out well," she said, her tone steady. But then, after a beat, she added, "But if you're asking how I feel about all of this, I don't know. I just can't tell if I'm really okay or not." Decker, unsure himself, responded quietly, "I'm not certain either, but I don't think anything will go wrong anytime soon." Ashia gave a faint smile, her voice soft but laced with caution. "Even so, there's no guarantee it won't. Just like how that man wouldn't even let us look him in the eyes, and now he's helping us rebuild Pervaz." Ashia finally urged, "It's late. You should get some rest. Unexpected things can happen at any moment." As she turned to leave, Decker suddenly grabbed her wrist, stopping her. His voice was firm, yet filled with concern. "Don't bury your feelings like this, Ashia. If you keep pushing them down, they're just going to explode at the worst possible time." Ashia pulled her hand away, a mix of frustration and confusion flashing across her face. "And what do you expect me to do, Decker?" she asked, her tone sharper now. "I don't even know what's wrong with me lately." Decker met her gaze, unwavering. "You do know," he said quietly. "You've just been pretending you don't. So, are you doing this because of Lord Carlisle?" Ashia's expression darkened, her eyes clouded with a sadness she couldn't quite hide. "Why do you always think everything has to do with Carlisle?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. For a moment, Decker stood silent, and then, as if struck by a sudden realization, he asked, "Did Carlisle hurt your pride somehow?" Ashia froze, shocked by the directness of the question. She didn't respond, her silence speaking louder than any words. Decker, unable to hold back his frustration, snapped at her, "Why are you hiding this from me? You know you can always tell me if something's troubling you." His voice was filled with concern, not anger. Ashia, finally reaching her breaking point, shouted back, "Everything is fine. We've got more support now than we ever dreamed of before. The lives of the young are thriving because of that. Things we never even thought possible are happening right in front of us. Of course I'm happy about that. But if I'm being honest, I wish I could have achieved it on my own." Her voice wavered, raw and vulnerable, the truth finally spilling out. Decker's expression softened as understanding dawned on him. Gently, he placed his hands on her shoulders, looking her straight in the eyes. "Ashia, do you remember what it was like when we came back from the battlefield? How horrible things were here." His voice grew firmer as he continued, "The only reason we're surviving now is because you allowed yourself to be sold off. Even if it's just a contract marriage, you gave up your freedom for the lives of others. They may not say it, but no one is ignorant of that fact." He paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "If it wasn't for you, Ashia, many people would have died during this winter. You changed our future, our miserable fate. You saved us. And no matter what anyone says, you are the only one they see as their lord, not His Majesty Carlisle Evaristo." Ashia, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and sorrow, reached out to calm Decker, gently placing her hand on his arm. "Thank you, Decker," she said softly, her voice regaining its steadiness. Inside, with newfound resolve, Ashia straightened her posture, determined to hold on to her role, her pride, and her strength. A few months later, near the end of April, Ashia stood by a window in Pervaz Castle, her eyes narrowing as she observed strange activity on the ground below. Carlisle, standing beside her, also noticed the peculiar objects scattered outside. He tilted his head, remarking, "That's different from what we saw the other day. It's bigger than a wagon but smaller than most merchant carriages." Ashia's brow furrowed as she studied the structure more closely. "It looks like it's made of bones," she guessed, her voice thoughtful. Carlisle glanced at her with curiosity. "Is it the Igram tribe, or maybe another one?" Ashia shook her head slightly. "I don't know. The barbarians from the Forgotten Lands have a habit of mixing with each other. They could be from any number of tribes." Her eyes grew more serious as she continued, they might be trying to form an alliance, especially since the most powerful tribe was recently defeated. But the other tribes usually don't take orders from anyone. If those are Igrams, they could be trying to lure us out and attack in large numbers. Carlane turned to her, his tone cautious. Then what are you planning to do? Ashia didn't answer right away. A memory from her childhood surfaced. She remembered standing beside her father. She had asked him, wide-eyed and full of youthful innocence, couldn't we just accept the barbarians as citizens of Pervaz? Her father's response had been calm but firm. We can't do that, Ashia. The reason they survive in the Forgotten Lands is because they've been contaminated. There's a strange energy that flows through those lands, something no one truly understands. It changes them. Ashia, her curiosity piqued, had asked her father, what happens when someone gets contaminated by that strange energy? Her father's face grew serious as he explained, they become extremely aggressive and destructive. He paused, then added, when Pervaz was its own kingdom, long before we became part of the empire, there were attempts to help the barbarians. Pervaz even tried sending them supplies, food, tools, resources. But the barbarians always chose to attack and loot instead of negotiating. They're driven by that contamination. It's why the king of Pervaz, in the end, had no choice but to pledge allegiance to the empire. We couldn't fight both the barbarians and survive as a kingdom on our own. Young Ashia had thought for a moment, then asked, is that why we can't use horses from the Forgotten Lands either? Her father nodded. That's right. Even the animals from those lands are affected. He continued, more casually this time, and whether it's due to their lack of education or intelligence, the barbarians have never been able to build anything complicated. Back in the present, Ashia couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The barbarians weren't known for building large, complex structures, certainly not anything as massive as the bone-made structure now visible on the battlefield. Suddenly, a servant burst into the room, breathless. My lady, your majesty, the barbarians are attacking us. Ashia and Carlane rushed to the window, and what they saw sent a chill down their spines. From the battlefield below, the barbarians revealed a new weapon, multiple trebuchets launching massive stones directly at Pervaz. The ground trembled with each hit as the barrage began. Without wasting a second, Ashia sprinted toward her group, her heart pounding. I need a full report, what's the situation? She demanded as soon as she reached them. Her soldiers scrambled to provide the details. The group attacking us is larger than last time, my lady, one of them reported grimly. It's the Igram tribe again, but their numbers are far bigger this time. We estimate about 2,000 of them, but we still haven't been able to identify their rear zone. They've positioned themselves strategically. Ashia clenched her fists, her mind racing. That's far more than we expected. They even outnumber us in cavalry. She could feel the pressure building. Without hesitation, Ashia made her decision. Turning sharply, she looked to the nearest soldier and gave her order. Get me an immediate line to His Majesty. Tell him I'm requesting his help directly. Ashia, feeling the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her, approached Carlane with a solemn expression. Your Majesty, I need your help, she admitted, her voice steady but tense. I promise you, I will definitely repay whatever is owed for it. Carlane, his expression softening with understanding, responded, Ashia, if Pervaz's army is annihilated, we'll suffer just as much. This isn't a favor, it's a battle we must fight, no matter what. Our fates are tied together now. Still, Ashia couldn't help but feel the burden of guilt. If only your highness hadn't come to Pervaz, she began, her frustration spilling out, we wouldn't have to pay such a high price for the damages. Before she could finish, Carlane interrupted her. Ashia, he said firmly, you might think I'm being arrogant, but it's you who is being arrogant for trying to shoulder the weight of Pervaz all by yourself. Carlane, sensing her inner turmoil, softened his tone. I understand your feelings. You've built Pervaz up from its foundations, it feels like it was only yesterday. But it doesn't all fall on you. You can repay me later. Right now, let's focus on protecting what you've worked so hard to create. As Ashia and Carlane stepped onto the battlefield, Ashia's mind raced with disbelief. How in the world do the barbarians have access to so many supplies? The sight before her was overwhelming. Carlane, his eyes narrowing in thought, contemplated the situation. If the supplies didn't come from within Pervaz, he mused, there's only one plausible answer, they must have come from outside. A smirk curled on his lips as he added, his tone dripping with sarcasm, spending money on supplies without expecting much in return, who could that be? I wonder which person is bold enough to encourage the Igrams to invade Pervaz. In that moment, Ashia's heart sank as realization dawned on her. Carlane was implying that Beatrice might be behind this sinister plot, aiming to force him to remain in Pervaz against his will. Noticing Ashia's worried expression, Carlane leaned closer and asked, are you afraid? Ashia shot back, her voice strong, do you really think we would be intimidated by this? Carlane chuckled lightly. I only asked because you don't look too well. Ashia, refusing to back down, replied sharply, it's not fear, it's anger. I'm just uncertain whether our armies can truly fight together. With a confident grin, Carlane reassured her, there must be some bond formed between our armies by now. With renewed determination, he turned to the soldiers, issuing orders with authority. All right, everyone, divide into the first, second, and third groups as we planned. Bailey, Solon, you take the right and left flanks respectively. Ashia and I will lead the charge. His voice was steady and commanding, instilling confidence in their ranks. Decker, you're in charge of defending the castle. And with that, the stage was set. Ashia felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins as Carlane and she took the lead, ready to face the oncoming storm. The battle was about to begin, and they were ready to fight for Pervaz with everything they had. In the midst of the chaotic battlefield, the tension was palpable. Suddenly, one of the barbarians lunged at Ashia with a menacing strike. But in a flash, Carlane stepped in front of her, his fierce gaze sending a chill down the barbarian's spine. With a swift and decisive blow, he slashed the attacker down, his movements a blend of grace and raw power. Ashia, not one to be outdone, quickly joined the fray, delivering precise and beautiful strikes of her own. One by one, she dispatched the enemies that dared to approach her, her sword dancing through the air like a deadly ballet. On the battlefield, they were more than just allies, they were two bodies moving as one soul. Each time one of them struck, the other was there to defend, their backs instinctively protecting each other as they cut through the onslaught of foes. Meanwhile, on the castle's upper window, painter Fabian Rusco stood transfixed, his heart racing as he observed the fierce collaboration between Carlane and Ashia. He had seen countless battles and warriors, but this was something entirely different. It was as if they were two halves of a single entity, moving in perfect harmony amidst the chaos of war. Fabian quickly realized that the bond they shared transcended mere friendship or duty. The place where they would confirm their love wasn't in some comfortable castle adorned with luxury, it was here, on this bloody battlefield, amidst the clash of swords and the cries of warriors. Inspired by the scene before him, he seized his brush and began to sketch furiously, imagining that this moment might just become his masterpiece, an immortal testament to the fierce love and unwavering partnership of two extraordinary souls fighting for their home.